Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on how to evaluate the right CGM or BGM approach for clinical research. My name is Grazia Morin, and I'll be moderating the conversation today. There's so much talk about GLP-1 trials across multiple indications. And with that, choosing the right approach to glucose monitoring is crucial. From patient burden to data quality, choosing between BGM and CGM isn't just about the device. It's a big part of clinical trial strategy. So I'm excited to introduce two experts who will help us unpack the operational, clinical, and cost considerations behind each approach. Joining us is Dr. Carl McAvoy, VP of eCOA and Patient Technology at YPrime, and Aubrey Verna, Senior Product Director at YPrime. Before we get started, if you have any questions, there is a chat bar on the side, and we will have a Q&A at the end of our conversation. So I'll pass it over to you, Aubrey.
Thanks, Grazia. So I really just wanted to kick us off by talking about how we got into the topic of CGM and BGM. It really just happened quite naturally for us. Several sponsors have been reaching out to us about our approach to BGM data collection and our recommended approach for leveraging CGM. You know, BGM has always been considered that gold standard, and it really still is considered that gold standard when it comes to blood glucose data collection. Regulators have really relied on the HbA1c and BGM as validated endpoints, whereas like with CGM-derived metrics, time in range, time below or above range, those are gaining traction, but they're not necessarily really universally accepted yet as primary endpoints for drug approval. So we get into this kind of hybrid approach in conversation, using CGM alerts to prompt BGM checks to verify those critical values, for example, BGM being used to confirm hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia and before that intervention. So with that, there's benefits to all of these approaches, BGM, CGM, hybrid models. We're really not here today clinically to discuss the prescribed approach. We know that there are clinical reasons why BGM or CGM would be utilized. The conversation today is kind of outside of that clinical context. Really what we want to focus on today is the benefits and risks of CGM and BGM, key factors or considerations that you can kind of look to when determining what your approach will be for measuring blood glucose within your studies. So with that, I'll pass it over to Carl to kick us off.
Thanks a lot, Aubrey. Hi, everybody. So adding to what Aubrey said, it's obvious we see an increase in the use of CGM and BGM with our sponsors and across clinical trials and across the industry. And we see, again, in patients' own lives, the adoption of CGM on top of the traditionally used BGM. But I guess from our perspective, we want to think a little bit about why it matters. And we're seeing this growth in a number of areas. It's not just the typical therapeutic approaches where you normally think glucose monitoring, you think diabetes, you might think weight management, given the new GLP-1 type drugs that are on the market. But there's a huge amount of therapeutic areas where we see BGM and now CGM being used. And so really the impact of glucose monitoring is quite varied and quite broad across clinical trials. Obviously, there's the patient safety element, traditionally looking at hypo or hyper events. But as Aubrey mentioned, we get a better scope with CGM. So we're seeing an increase in volume of data, typically changes in data quality, easier to spot trends, easier to look at how the patient is getting on through the trial. But then there's broader considerations that maybe impact the operational considerations of the trial. So things like the study cost. We look at the cost of BGM versus CGM for an individual patient globally. It can vary dramatically, with BGM being quite reasonably priced in comparison, being an older technology and being something that's a little bit more ubiquitous, where the sensors for CGM can be a little bit more cost prohibitive in some cases. But we'll touch on that as we go through the slides. We'll also dig in a little bit deeper on the next slide about data quality when I pass back to Aubrey. But I think what I want to highlight through my section is the idea that patient side and burden comes into play quite a lot. And we want to think about that when it comes to choosing one strategy or both within the trial. And I think, as Aubrey mentioned, BGM and CGM tend to be used in tandem more and more. We haven't quite gotten to a space where CGM is being used as a replacement for BGM. And again, we'll touch on that throughout the presentation. It's also worth keeping in mind for individuals who aren't familiar with the two technologies, they are very different. They work in a different way. The mechanism is different. with blood glucometry, the traditional self-administered version being the detection of glucose within a blood sample involving the traditional finger prick, but the CGM approach being taken from interstitial tissue, which in general takes about a 15-minute lag between a change physiologically and an increase in your blood glucose that can be measured through that fluid. So the timing and what you're seeing can drift slightly. And also BGM has a track record, both from a regulatory perspective and from patients using it historically. We could argue it's probably the first device integration we would have seen within the industry, and it's been going around for a long, long time. And as I mentioned, we see an evolving range of therapeutic areas, and with that comes the consideration of how we handle that change in data outside of spaces like diabetes, where we're used to seeing that volume traditionally.
So I was going to jump in on the next slide and really talk about the user journey just at a super high level. I want to make sure we're all on the same playing field here. I know there are many experts on the line when it comes to CGM and BGM, but I want to really take a look at the user journey specific to eCOA and the eCOA kind of approach, if you will, to both CGM and BGM. From a CGM perspective, the participant or patient is going to have the CGM sensor. They're going to insert that sensor into their skin. They're going to pair that CGM sensor with the eCOA application. And then they're going to wear that sensor and have the system really passively collect data over a period of 7 to 14 days. This is plus or minus. It's very dependent on the CGM device specifically, but generally speaking, what they're going to do is going to replace that sensor at the end of the expiration period for that particular sensor. They're going to then need to repair the new sensor with the application. So the CGM journey for the participant revolves around that passive data capturing and really the cyclical, replacement and repair of that sensor with the application within the necessary intervals. As far as BGM is concerned, there is no sensor within that approach, right? So you have that blood glucose monitoring device, the BGM device. That is where the participant is going to take readings. They're going to prick their finger, as Carl mentioned, and grab that blood glucose value at certain intervals within the study. So generally speaking, I've seen, 3 SMBG values required a day to 7. It depends on protocol, but generally speaking, they're going to kind of log those for the day and then upload those readings by connecting their BGM device directly with the application via Bluetooth connection. So both journeys here, CGM or BGM, you've got that Bluetooth connection, which is allowing readings to be uploaded. So within the BGM, the readings would be uploaded at the patient's discretion. And then if there are readings that require, additional diaries to be completed, generally what we see is that if there's a hypoglycemic reading or a hyperglycemic reading that's uploaded, upon categorization of that reading, there may be additional event-driven diaries or symptom diaries to complete as part of that journey. And then as far as the site and sponsor is concerned, their journey really doesn't shift much depending on CGM or BGM. At the end of the day, for the site and the sponsor, regardless of the approach, they're really looking to be able to log in to their web application from their provider, review the data that's being uploaded, whether it's happening via BGM or CGM, and then make any decisions, both clinical and just decisions based off of that data. Whether that's via reports or insights, they're logging in to view real time or as the data is uploaded in the case of BGM, the data at hand to make the decisions necessary. So with that, I want to jump into talking around the data itself. So with CGM, there's a significant amount of data that is uploaded or is really to be managed versus BGM. And that's really what I kind of want to focus on and dive into a little bit here today. So, for the purposes of today and assumptions being made, if we assume that we have a CGM device that's collecting data every 5 minutes and we have a year-long study, you're looking at over 100,000 records per patient for the course of a study that's utilizing CGM. It's, a significant amount of data. For BGM, if we assume just 5 data points are required per day for a year-long study, you're looking at just under 2,000 data points per patient per year. So you can see the difference between the two is stark. The CGM data frequency is high frequency, high volume. And with that, we really just need to make sure that we have the robust infrastructure to be able to support such a large data set. It's no surprise to me, and I don't think a lot of you on the call would disagree here. The industry, from a technology perspective, can be a bit flat-footed when it comes to these things. So just making sure that we have the infrastructure to support us will be a must. I think CGM and really any other passive data collection where we have these high data sets are going to really force us to rethink the way we're handling things by way of data transfers and data management. Traditional flat file integrations just can't scale in the way to support the amount of data that would be anticipated or expected for CGM. And really, in this view, we're talking about one patient. If you have a study, with a significant number of patients, that just exponentially grows. So I think in all, sponsors are going to need systems that will listen, and vendors need systems that are going to real time push updates as they're receiving this data directly into whatever cloud or data warehouse approach is necessary. So we absolutely will need to move toward a more scalable approach because you're really talking about millions of data points to manage and collect a year. With that, not only do we need the ability, I was just still on that other slide. Not only do we need the ability to manage for these large data sets, we also need the ability to make clinical decisions based off of these large data sets. So additional factors that we need to look at for CGM, would it be time in range, time below range, time above range, these glycemic variability indices. We need to make sure that our data views allow us to really be able to understand this data that's coming in, analyze this data that's coming in, so that those clinical decisions can be made. So, CGM is going to require expertise in large data sets and, the technology to support those large data sets. And it's just something you need to consider when you're looking to implement CGM specifically. Conversely, when we talk about data, go ahead, jump over to the next slide. I wanted to kind of flip what I was just talking about on its head and discuss what it looks like when data is missed. So as far as BGM and CGM is concerned, when there is significant impact, I would say, when data is missed from a BGM perspective. So BGM loss of data would be loss of key time points. There's not as many of them. So I would say, that loss is greater, more impactful. Whereas with CGM, there are large data sets. I think you're at risk of, if you miss a day worth of CGM data, that's a lot more data. But because of the large data set, there is, the impact of loss there is less. As far as BGM is concerned, I think we look at 2 items specifically when we're looking at data loss. It's either patient noncompliance or a device issue. BGMs have been around for quite some time, so I'll stick to talking about noncompliance when it comes to BGM. And I think one of the main failure points is just, with patient noncompliance, it's going to be finger prick fatigue or just really not completing those diaries, right? So traditionally in eCOA, we have kind of risk mitigation already in place, right? So we've got compliance tracking initiatives, we've got patient engagement features, there's training and education that we can do. There is the ability, I think, for BGM to really mitigate that data loss quickly and really an approach and in a way that we've been kind of moving toward as an industry in general. With CGM, I think the mitigation of data loss is a little bit more challenging. So, you've got things like incorrect placement of the CGM device specifically, issues with adhesion or that sensor falling off. So, if there's lotions that the participant is using, if they're in water a lot, for example, there could be the sensor could fall off in those cases. I think there's also device malfunctioning issues that we need to look at. So whether it's a sensor insertion error or if the CGM isn't calibrated correctly, there are additional areas of data loss or data inaccuracy that we have to really look at for CGM. I think there's risks to each approach, BGM and CGM, but I think risk mitigation should just be a consideration when you're choosing your blood glucose monitoring strategy for your study.
Thanks, Aubrey. So I guess it's obviously a feature or a facility that eCOA providers can do. We know, having CGM or BGM within a study is a really straightforward process for here at YPrime. The device integration is something that we've done several times. But for me, I think we need to consider with that volume of data and with the attractiveness of all of those data points, we want to really hone in on measuring what matters for patients and for the protocol. It's a really attractive offer to have hundreds of thousands of data points per patient. And we see this with wearables, we see this with activity tracking. And there is a time and a place for that. If we know what we're going to analyze, we know what we're truly tracking and what changes we're looking to see or hoping to see within a patient population. But from my perspective, I think ultimately the decision is driven by the endpoint. So thinking about the strategy, thinking about what we are monitoring, what we're looking to see within the patient population, that can dictate if we use one type of blood glucometry over another. So if we have a standard finger prick and a CGM or just a standard finger prick alone. And again, I think this comes back to some of the population or the study requirements. We see over time the change in the therapeutic areas we're using these devices in. But I think ultimately the scales and the sort of endpoints we're looking at are what really drive this decision. So if we're thinking about things like glucose trends or fluctuations over time, there's arguably a benefit of having CGM there. We're getting broader data. We're getting much more from patients. We're potentially capturing hypo and hyper events that we don't normally see with BGM. We know there are populations who maybe can't detect themselves the symptoms or the signs of a low blood sugar event, but they are happening and their condition just prevents them from knowing that. So from a safety perspective, from logging some of those trends, again, it makes sense to support that patient group with the CGM as well as the BGM. We also want to make sure that we're not overdoing it. So if point in time measurement with the finger prick is enough and that's part of your endpoint, I think that in most cases is fair, and we don't need to necessarily add another device. Traditionally, we see the blood glucose used as a gold standard. It's typically a surrogate endpoint. We often see it as a composite endpoint in addition to some PROs. Again, that's very specific to the diabetes scenarios. But as we start to move into other indications or when we're investigating comorbidities or drug interactions, we can start to move away from that point in time to maybe a broader scope. It's also worth considering the patient population again. So things like age group, we see this with eCOA. People ask, can older patients use the technology? I'd argue in diabetes over most other indications, it's probably a straight yes, because a lot of these individuals would have started measuring blood glucose levels way back when the monitors first came out. And a lot of diabetes patients who I've spoken to have often followed the trends in technology and oftentimes have started to use CGM before their consultant would even start to consider that for themselves. I think ability comes into play. And in this scenario, I think more about pediatric populations. We don't necessarily want to have a parent pricking a child a couple of times a day. There's a lot of burdens, a lot of stress on patients, on the child, on the parents. So perhaps in that scenario, CGM is better. Again, we'll explain on the next slide, there's probably a benefit of needing the BGM too for calibration. But we want to make sure that we're covering all of those bases, but suiting the patient's lifestyle and sort of meeting them where they are. And then, of course, familiarity with blood glucose monitoring can have a massive impact as well. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of those considerations. So when we talk about BGM and CGM, we often hear BGM or CGM, and I think that's a bit of a sort of a misconception. So we tend to always see BGM, even if CGM is involved in the study. BGM is there for accuracy. It's there as a bit of a safety net. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for me, the considerations really are sort of multifaceted. So we wouldn't just say because of the study length, we do or don't use CGM. We wouldn't say based on the population, we do or we don't. We take all of these considerations as a whole. So we would look at study length, we'd look at the patient population, we'd investigate the impact of burden on those patients. We don't want to be overestimating or over testing patients if we don't need to. Cost also comes into it. Again, these are sort of sliding scales depending on the duration of the study, the number of patients, that will all change. And of course, logistics. We don't always see the same blood glucose devices available in every country. Sometimes approvals, sometimes availability, sometimes model of a device will change in geographic regions. So that brings in an additional consideration for the shipping of monitors. There's far more consistency and standardization in the typical BGM models, whereas CGM, although there's a cohort of commonly used devices, regulatory acceptance, reimbursement, adoption by patient groups tends to differ by area. So as I said, we always see BGM. It's known historically for its greater accuracy. Patient populations are generally more familiar with this. Anybody who has diabetes, anybody who's been and had their blood glucose checked with a physician will all understand what the finger prick test is going to be. And of course, global reach in terms of socioeconomic differences. We know medically we're going to have the ability to get these blood glucometers to the patients as we need them. But for CGM, there's sort of additional considerations. So we can broaden the scope of what we're monitoring. So if we're thinking about safety interactions, if we're thinking of detecting trends or spotting hypo or hyper events before they happen, there's definitely evidence out there to show that these real-time trends and spotting of a patient going up or down can have a massive impact. And we know percentage-wise, we see better glycemic control in patients who've used CGMs, and there's lots of studies that support that finding. But also we want to make sure that if we're using a primary endpoint that relates to variability or time in range, along with maybe a PRO, the CGM could give a better, more holistic view of that data. And then on the next slide, I'll talk about a couple of scenarios where we see one or both, and maybe start to think a little bit about where we might see CGM used solo in the future. So I think I started at the beginning by talking about diabetes, and I know we're sort of constantly referencing that as a therapeutic area, but I just want to call it this first scenario on the slide where we don't always work within diabetes or within weight management when we think about BGM. For years, we've seen it commonly used in oncology. That's probably the first place it started to be seen outside of the diabetes space. But we see it in lots of rare diseases. We see it in other symptoms and symptomology like polycystic ovaries. We see it in anxiety and stress disorders. There's lots of scenarios where blood glucose readings are important. So a good example of maybe a different approach we've had here at YPrime is for a phase 3 rare disease study where we had less than 15 patients spread globally at 5 sites. And with that, for BGM, we were able to build in notifications and prompts that were triggered by the readings to give an event-driven diary for the patient. And in that scenario, the endpoint or one of the endpoints for the study was a change in baseline of HbA1c, and that was done postprandial each morning across the lifetime of the study. A typical scenario where we see both would be where we want to collect minimal BGM data. So as Aubrey said, between sort of 1 and 7 times a day. I've seen protocols where we think about maybe once a week or 3 times a week minimum for BGM, and it's decided by the physician at site based on the patient, and it's left to the physician's discretion if we should monitor more or less. But where we see CGM adding to that is to give us deeper insight to that data. So again, looking at time and range, spotting trends, or often where we see them is to compare BGM and CGM as an exploratory endpoint, building up that evidence that Aubrey alluded to earlier, where we can start to substitute potentially CGM for BGM. And a typical approach there is to blind a group or a cohort in CGM collectively, and then split them in the next arm of the study where we start to look at CGM versus BGM and look at their overall control and compare that to a couple of weeks of blinded CGM data. So there's a wealth of information in the literature which starts to look into that, and we see some trends across different patient populations. So as I said, as an industry, we're not quite there yet with CGM as an exclusive use. And in fact, we see CGM manufacturers often highlighting to users that if your symptoms don't match the readings, or for the first 24 hours, the readings on the CGM are sometimes less accurate, they often tell the user to go back, check with a BGM just to confirm. So I think we're not quite there yet in terms of replacing, but there's a different way of measuring. So looking at time and range, variability, overall management, I think there's definitely a place there for CGM. And then on my last slide, I just want to jump quickly into some of the growing uses and the variety of trials we see. So as I said, we have trust from patients, from participants with BGM. It's been around for a long, long time. Most users are familiar with it. But CGM manufacturers and clinicians and trial protocols generally always call out the use of BGM when CGM is being used. From a practical perspective, it's for calibration, but from a safety perspective and from an accuracy perspective, we want to make sure that the patients are covered there. As we see, BGM has sort of stayed static over the years. The technology hasn't changed very much. Devices have gotten smaller. The analysis is the same. The technology is broadly the same. But CGMs are really rapidly changing. And last year, we saw the approval from the FDA of the first 365-day sensor. Now, it's slightly different to the patch that we stick on. It's embedded under the skin, but that can last for a full year without having to be replaced, and potentially without some of the considerations that Aubrey mentioned, where patches might fall off. It's not always super positive. It's not always, we'll say, better than BGM, but there have been populations where 50% of the patients using CGM still struggle to meet the management of their glycemic changes. So, again, it's thinking about what we're measuring, thinking about the patient population. But in consideration to that, we also see a great development from some of our clinical trial sponsors, where they're looking at the back end of this. So taking that data and using AI and applications to predict glycemic events based on trends. There's some sponsors who've done really large studies with some of their patient cohorts, but also done in silico modeling. And they're starting to predict with great accuracy potential events before they happen using CGM data, which I think is an incredible jump forward for patients and for the data we collect, and back to Aubrey of how we actually monitor, collect, and analyze that data. One thing I will call out before I end, though, is just that smartwatches and wearables, although they're often integrated in these trials too, the FDA are very clear that they don't want trials or private users assessing their blood glucometry through a smartwatch. The optical sensors just are nowhere near the accuracy, despite what potential marketing claims might say. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Grazia.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. We're getting close to the bottom of the hour, and we do try to keep this at half an hour. We have a few questions that came in, and if anyone else has questions, feel free to enter them. We will touch base with you after the webinar. I'll see if I can get to a question in 30 seconds, and this one's for Aubrey. You talked through the massive quantity of data. How do we go about even visualizing this data? Can you share some light on that?
Yes, so I think you have to work really closely with your eCOA vendor in terms of data visualization and making sure that this data, quote unquote, works for you, if you will. So ensuring that you have, trend lines, that you have kind of different visualizations that are able to be made possible with your eCOA vendor provider, really whoever's kind of managing this data for you, is very important. And there's definitely different tools out there that can help facilitate this, but the most important thing is making sure that not only is this data being, received and saved and managed correctly, but also that it's working for you, right? That you're able to put it to use and make those clinical decisions that you need to make based off of it.
Thank you, Aubrey. I guess with that, we will be in touch with the additional questions coming in. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. If you have any questions, please reach out to the YPrime team at any time. We are here to help, and we hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you, everyone.